Greetings viewers, Eric the Car Guy. Before me, I have an 8.8 differential that's all in pieces, all new pieces. The intent in this video is to put all these pieces together, get them in here, get everything set up properly, and get it ready to install in the car behind me. Before this video is over, I hope to show how to set up the preload on the pinion and also how to set backlash, check gear tooth pattern, all that stuff. There will also be additional information down in the description. Please check there if you have questions. This video is going to cover, as I said, installing this differential and these new gears. These are 355 gears that I have going into here and everything involved with that. I have all the parts laid out before me. Here's some shims for the differential bearings. I also have some shims here for the pinion head should we need to move that. I've also got new pinion bearings as well as a new pinion seal and new C-clips for the axles. This is also getting converted over to 5-lug and 31 spline axles. Step one, I'm going to press the bearings onto the differential assembly. I want to make sure that I keep the races with the bearings. So knowing that this is going to be installed inside the differential like this, I'm going to keep these races on the same side. This race is going to be on this side, and this race will stay on this side. As an extra measure, I'm just going to mark the bearings similar to the way I marked my bearing caps. This will be the left side, 2 marks for the right. Now that I'm thinking about it, I can do the same with the race. To do this, I'm going to take this whole assembly over to my press. First bearing to get pressed on the big side. I'm going to go grab the race because right now what this means is I'm probably pressing right on these bearings, and that's not a good idea. So I'm going to put the race, put it inside of its race, and I'm going to press it into the race. This way when I press, the force will be distributed into the race and it won't be totally on the bearing. It's not going to go in that rough. I just want to make sure that it goes in without any issues. And this begs the question, Eric, why don't you press both bearings on at the same time? Because I'm not. There's no shims under these, so these just bottom out. Undamaged and happy. Other side. Perfect. Now I'm going to mount the ring gear onto the differential assembly. Before I do that, it is absolutely positively imperative that there are no burrs or anything on this surface. Therefore, I'm going to go around it with this file and make sure that everything is nice and smooth and ready for the differential. Now I need to install the ring gear onto the differential. Now Ford says to install some sort of Loctite retaining compound on the backside here. I'm not doing that. I will also post a link in the description to the PDF that goes to the instructions for this because it contains other valuable information. That being said, the new bolts come with Loctite, so I'm not too concerned about that, but I'm going to get it started with 2 bolts, take it over to the press. There's like this little last bit here before it goes down onto the differential that is a press fit. So I'm going to take it over to the press and use a couple of differential bolts to help guide it down into place. Ford does recommend doing that. I suppose it's also a good idea to make sure that there's no debris or anything on this surface either. Probably the easiest way to do this is like this. Just sort of bring it up so I can eyeball where the bolts will go. Why not use them all as guides? I can't really see the harm. I don't know how well this is going to work. Like I said, this is what's outlined in the instructions from Ford. I don't feel comfortable pressing on metal onto this new gear, so I've put these wood blocks underneath it. I'm hoping all I need to do is take up that little bit of clearance and everything will be fine. In a fight between metal and wood, I pick metal. I think they want you to do it like this rather than drawing it up with the bolts. I think that's the idea here. And this is either going to wreck my wood blocks, which who cares? And I'm kind of hearing that a little bit. They're just sort of digging in. But the bolt heads just came up, so. That worked. I'm now going to tighten and torque the bolts the rest of the way. I'm going to use my vise to do it. I'm also going to use these wood blocks. Once again, they've been friendly to me so far. I want to see how far I can take this. Perfect. It's not going anywhere. I'm going to tighten these down in stages. I think it was 95 to 100 foot-pounds is the final torque on this. Maybe I'll go 4 stages. Maybe I'll go 25, 50, 75, 100. Maybe that's what I'll do. That way I'm sure that everything's all nice and even. To save time, I'm going to run these all down. They have Loctite, so they have a little bit of resistance to them. I'm just going to run them down with the impact just till they're snug. I made short work of it. I'm going to use my 1/2-inch torque wrench on this. It only goes down to 50 foot-pounds, so that whole 25 foot-pound thing, I don't think that's as important because I'm not drawing this up onto the differential with these bolts. I already did that on the press, so really all I'm doing is a final torque. So I think considering my target is going to be like 95 foot-pounds, I don't think I'm going to have a problem starting at 50. Crisscross pattern, just like I did when I ran them down. I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but these are Ford gears that I'm using and Ford parts. It's a Ford differential also. And I'm taking my information directly from the Ford PDF, which will be linked in the description. I just rechecked the torque spec and it says 97 to 102 foot-pounds on these. I'm gonna go for 100, right in the middle. Right now, since I've already gone to 50, I'm gonna go to 80, and then we'll take it all the way up to that final 100. Let's take it to that 100. Bolts are all torqued, ring gears installed, bearings are installed, differential is pretty much complete. It's really safe and happy in the vise here. I'm just gonna leave it while I go and bang on stuff in the differential case. Previous video shows all the wonderful paint and prep work that I did on this. Now it's time to re-engage. And I'm going to start by installing the races for the pinion bearings. This one goes in the front, inside here, and there's another one that needs to go back in through the other side. Keep the bearing in the bag, keep stuff off of it. I have just the tool for this. This is a bushing seal driver. It's made for doing exactly this. You can borrow these from the auto parts store. I would strongly suggest that you do, because this will help ensure that your bearing races don't get damaged. And yes, this is the first time I'm using this, but I got this tool just for this job because I knew I'd be doing it. Got it at J&B Tools, by the way. Link in the description to this and more. Just drive the race into place. That rhymes. The sound will change when it's where it needs to be. Hear how the sound changed? Means it's home. We need to flip this around because we need to install the other race from the other direction. It's like Christmas, we're unwrapping presents. It's just what I wanted. I'm trying to size up the driver here, and this one's a bit small, and this one is a bit large. Playing Goldilocks here. I'm almost thinking I'd be better off doing it this way, that way I catch the edge. Knocking it down in there, it won't help center it as much, but I don't want to risk damaging the inner part of this race. If I do, I'll be looking for a new bearing. The race goes in here, and hopefully I can get this down in here square. Not as square as I'd hoped. Given the way this is going down, I'm actually going to drive it back out and start over. Finally, now it's time to install the pinion inside the housing and get things set up. In a previous video, in fact during the disassembly video, I had made this bearing, this is the old pinion bearing, a little bit wider. You can see how I hollowed out the inside of that a little bit. And what that allows it to do is it allows it to just slip right down onto the pinion without being pressed. This is normally a pressed fit. The reason I did this is I want to make sure that I set my pinion depth correctly. And to do that, we'll practice with this bearing first before we go and install our final new bearing. Underneath that bearing is a shim that came with it originally that we're going to transfer over to our new pinion. Also going to take our practice bearing and put it onto here like this. Now I have 3 of these crush sleeves which get installed next in order to fit on here, so I can try this on multiple times in order to get it right. I'm not going to be using the final nut either. Actually, here's everything in the setup. So I've got a nut, it's got special Loctite and everything already on it. I'm not going to use this until final assembly. So for now, I'm just going to take this on here so that we can practice, and I'm going to use this pinion nut. Additionally, I am not going to be putting anything else in here but the bearing. So I won't be putting my pinion seal, any of that stuff. I don't want to damage it. So I'm leaving my pinion seal out, and I'm leaving my oil slinger, which is over here somewhere. This also has to go in behind the seal and behind the bearing when everything is all put together like so. I got this flange off of my Mustang, and I'm using it because it's more stout than the one that came with this differential originally, and it will work just fine. It splines up to this. It'll work great. I'm using this not only because it's stronger, but it's also got this little seal protector. But if you look at this ridge on the inside here, I can hit that with my fingernail. And one of the places that's most prone to leak on a differential is the pinion seal. Therefore, I'm going to be installing this kit right here. Here's a part number for you. And what this is an installation tool, but this is a sleeve that's going to fit down over here and pretty much renew this surface, so that when I put this in, it's like having a fresh surface for that pinion seal. The fit of this bearing is such to where it's not going down far enough for me to even get this thing to start to spline. I looked into this, and this is a very real possibility, and it's due to the coating that's on the outside of this here. Therefore, I'm just going to hit it with a little bit of crocus cloth to try and take that surface off of there, because it's a little grabby, and it's just big enough to where it won't allow this to slide down. Got my bearings and stuff out of the way. Once I'm done with this, I'll clean it up, because obviously I don't want to get sand or abrasive material down inside my differential. At least the splines are catching, and the nut starts to thread on. Okay, that's enough to get us started. Shim, practice bearing, and crush sleeve. This is actually the second version of this video, and the reason being is because I ran into some difficulty that I got some really great help from the people at King's Ford here in Cincinnati, and also the Ford Performance Tech line. Oddly, both of those guys were named Steve. Anyway, there was something that I did in the disassembly part of this video, or video series I should say, in that I took the old pinion head bearing and I hollowed it out in order to make it a setup bearing for this whole process. Well, the reason why I'm doing this video again is because I did that very thing. Don't do this. You have 2 options. Purchase another pinion bearing, a separate one, and use that and hollow it out in the same way I did this if you want an easy setup pinion head bearing, or have a really good bearing splitter, and I'll show you why. So here's the old bearing that I took off and I hollowed out, and here's the new bearing. And you can see they are very different. And because of that difference, it made it impossible for me to set it up and get a proper gear tooth pattern. So here's tip number one that I can give you. Don't do what I did in this instance. What we're gonna have to do is go through the process of actually pressing this onto the pinion and go through the rest of the setup, and we'll check the gear tooth pattern and see what we have with the proper bearing in place. After talking at Steve on the Ford Performance Tech line, one of the things he mentioned as far as what shim to use on the pinion to start with, he said start with somewhere between 24 and 28 thousandths. Closest shim I have here right now is 22. Actually, this is 21. Yeah, 23. So this is very similar to the original one. This one was also around 21, 22. So really it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen the other. I'm just grabbing this new shim. So we're going to start with this 22, 23 thousandths shim on the pinion. Going to press on the bearing and start this process. Is our old pinion head bearing completely useless? No, it's not. So we're going to modify it now so that we can use it to press on the new bearing. And to do that, we're going to cut the cage and the bearing off the outside. Going to try to catch the bits. Here's my setup. I've got my shim, 22-ish thousandths. Pinion head bearing's gonna go on next. Here's my old bearing race that I'm gonna use to press on here, because you don't want to press on this cage at all. It's very important that you don't press on that part. Before that, I was using a crush sleeve as a setup. This is a new crush sleeve that I'm going to be using. I actually bought some extra of these, so really good idea to pick up some extra crush sleeves because you may need more than one. You can only use them once, and you can only go forward. You can never go backwards. Before I do the install of this bearing, I'm going to add some friendly lube. Before final assembly, I'm going to be installing my pinion seal, but right now I'm just leaving it out so that I can get my setup correct. Once my setup is correct, I'll do this for final assembly. But this way, I don't risk damaging the seal while I'm setting it up. Other outer bearing. This is the oil slinger. I'm putting it in there just because it goes in there. I'm reusing the old nut. I'm doing this until I go to final assembly. This way I don't have to ruin the nut, because the nuts are also one-time use. They have special Loctite coating on there, everything, so once you go to commit to this, you want to make sure that you've got everything set up properly. It's an 1 1/16 nut. Now I'm going to run it down with this impact, but you want to make sure that you can spin it and that it spins loosely, because you need to set this whole thing is set up on preload. That's what that crush sleeve is for. So you need to set this up for preload. So in other words, don't run it down with the impact till it stops. Just run it down till it's snug and you've taken up the slack, and then I'll show you how to tighten the rest of the way. Well, looks like our crush sleeve is already in play. This is a pinion holding flange tool. It's not that expensive. I'll link it in the description. You can make one yourself. Really, you just need something to hold the pinion flange, hence the name. These bolts are the existing bolts that go in for the flange. You don't need to tighten them all the way down. In fact, you don't want to. Main reason is this 1/2 inch drive that's supposed to go in here doesn't really fit all that well, so you may have to lift the tool up a little. Super long breaker bar. There's also provisions for what looks like actually a 1 inch drive. On my other breaker bar, I have an extension. And with this, well, it's a test of strength and will, and sometimes your gut. We got a ways to go. This makes me want to use my old crush sleeve. I still have a ways to go before I even get this thing to make contact and get going together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my old crush sleeve for this part just for setup. For final assembly, new crush sleeve, absolutely. I don't want the pinion to fall. I don't know how much help it's going to be. It really doesn't look that much more crushed. And that may be because I was using it with that old bearing. Let's try this again. I'm going to take a little more time and try to run it down a bit more. Just to the point where it makes contact and there's no more slop. Feels good. There's still lots of play there. We can take up the rest with breaker bars. That might be a little too much, actually. That is too much. Let's check it. Using an inch-pound torque wrench to check the resistance on these bearings. It should be 16 to 28 inch-pounds. And I am 35, so I went too far. Now, during final setup, you're never, ever, never supposed to loosen this. Never. So never loosen. This, we're just doing setup, so I'm just trying to get it where it needs to be, so I am going to loosen it. It's coming back off anyway, but you're not supposed to do this. Barely. It's almost 30, so I'm probably right at the ragged edge of 28. Now that I have the preload on the pinion bearing set up, I'm going to flip it and install the carrier. When you install the differential, I have my bearing cup or race ready to go on this left-hand side and the shims to go with it. This is what I came up with last time for a good backlash reading. So you install this left side first, leave the shims out of the right side and just slide the carrier into place. But shims and everything on the left going first. I take my fingers and put them in here to make sure it all stays together until it goes in. Now hold it in place, get the bearing cap. Now I marked these when I did disassembly. Aside from those markings, there's those arrows that point towards the outside of the axle. But it's very important that you get these back in exactly the way they came out. But you want something in there holding it in place so it doesn't come rolling out on you. For this side, push the bearing cup over, and sometimes you can sneak a pry bar in here, try to straighten things out before you put the shims in. Going in pretty easy. I'm starting with a rubber hammer or plastic. However, there is a tool available that you can purchase. This is kind of expensive, or you can make these just out of steel stock. One thing I am noticing is that the top end is kind of getting mushroomed out a little bit on this one. And it was kind of expensive, but really it's made just for this task. You get it in here, give it a couple of taps to get the bearing shim in place. It's my cap for the right side. I marked it when I disassembled it, but also once again it has arrows that point towards the outside of the axle. I also put some oil on the differential bearings before I installed it in the same way I did on that new pinion head bearing. I can tell you right now that's too much. I'll tighten these down, but there's way too much backlash right there. That's like a mile. It needs to be 8 to 12 thousandths. That's like 30. These are 3/4. Normally to check a backlash measurement, you want to torque these to spec, which is 100 foot-pounds. Actually, I think it's 97 to 102 to be absolutely specific, but I've been torquing them to 100 foot-pounds. Given that this isn't even close, I'm not even going to bother torquing them. I'm just going to check the backlash real quick to see where I'm at and then figure out a plan on how to correct it. For checking backlash, you're going to need a tool that's equivalent to this. It's a dial indicator. It has a magnetic base. You basically need to, well, install it similar to this to check the backlash. It's kind of cool because that magnet sets up like that. Whoa. Sphincter factor 12, whenever that thing starts to move, it's a precision measuring equipment and it just seems to love jumping off and falling on the floor, so be careful. And the needle does favor jumping around like that. Oh, I was wrong. It's almost 50 thousandths. So it's supposed to be way less than this. This is a ridiculous amount of backlash. We're going to correct that with some shims. I'm sure you noticed when I installed the differential that there were shims behind the bearing races on both sides. These are what we're going to use to set backlash. They locate the differential assembly in the housing here. Now, in this case, we have too much backlash, so we want to decrease it. So what we'll do is we'll remove shims from this side and add them to this side. If we had just the opposite problem and there was very little backlash, we wanted to increase it, we'd remove our shims from this side and add them to this side. I'm actually going to try something. Since this is the first time I have this set up quote unquote correctly, I have the correct pinion head bearing on here now, and actually things feel way different than they did the last time I went through this whole process. This was the original shim that went into this side. I'm going to try installing the original shims and see what backlash I have, then take things from there. Undoing these, but leaving the cap in there with a couple of threads on here. That way when I go to pry it out, I don't run the risk of it falling on the floor. And to remove it, take a couple of pry bars, sneak in behind the differential, and it'll come right out. In fact, I don't think I have the preload set correctly, so I think doing this like we're doing it from scratch, best case scenario. Okay, well, this side has an extra shim in it. This was the original shim that came on this side. Got two shims over on this side. Just going to swap that one out for this. Put up with a pry bar, straighten it up, makes it go in easier. Oh, and when you install these shims, you'll notice there's a beveled edge. On the factory shims, the beveled edge always faces towards the outside of the axle housing. Zero. That's what I had initially. So this is not going to work. It's too thick. Wait a minute. Maybe not. I'm going to run these down and see what that is. Huh. Now we'll torque them to spec. When you go and do the final torque on these, do it in stages. I'm going to go to 70 and then to 100. Now we'll check the backlash. Still too much. So we're a little bit out. So we need to, once again, remove from this side and add to this side. So I'm going to measure this shim and measure this shim and then keep the same clearance, but swap it from side to side. There is a certain amount of bearing preload that needs to be on these tapered bearings, so I'm kind of glad that it's in there more snugly than it was originally. All to bring you the best differential setup video I possibly can. The kit that I got from Ford Performance came with shims for this very thing. And I'm going to use those shims in order to get the correct backlash that I need for the assembly. So I'm first going to measure the original shims to find out how thick they are. and then try to make it so that I have a little more on this side and a little less on this side. Remember, we were a little high on our backlash reading, so we want to bring that down a bit. So we want slightly more over here, slightly less over here. Having made many adjustments to this up to this point, I know each one of these thinnest shims is about 1/2 millimeter. And I think that 1/2 millimeter would be great over on this side. So I'm going to add 1/2 millimeter to this side over here. So I'll have that, and actually that originally started out as, why don't we just check our measurement, 254, 253 with this shim, which is also about 19 thousandths, somewhere around that neighborhood. Adding that to this side makes it 274 total over here. We need to decrease the thickness of this shim by about that same 1/2 millimeter. So right now this entire thing is about 306. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stack these until I reach that 306, or find out how close I can get. That's 209. I'm just going to go with these other thicker shims here and just sort of stack them up. 295, 296. This might do it right here. That's a little much, 316. So that's the dilemma that I have. So if I remove just one of these shims, I think it'll get me about as close in the ballpark as I can. If these shims were different thicknesses, I could have a little more breathing room and a little more to play with, but I don't. This is what I've got. We're going from, I have to get the calculator to do the math real quick, but we're going from this 304, 303 to 295 on this. And we're going from 251 to 272 over on this side. It seems like it's going to be tight, if I'm honest. I almost want to remove one more shim from this side. Oh, for some reason this comes up 300 now. And because I'm stacking them like this, it's difficult to get an accurate reading. So this is 295, so that's still a bit much, because we're trying to take 20 thousandths from here and add it over to here. And if we start out at 306, we need to be down in the 280s. And this seems 297. That seems like a bit high. We're not really taking all that much away. We almost need to take one more of these, which I think is not going to be quite enough. Well, 288, 289. That's close. That's close. So I'm actually going to try this setup and see, just sort of see the resistance going in. Like I said, I've done this enough times now to where I really got a feel for the preload that gets on the differential and everything else, but ultimately we're trying to get a good backlash reading. Same drill as before, keeping the bearing caps in place. Got to keep all my stuff for the left over here stacked up and ready. For these, I always take the thinner shims and put them towards the inside. Feels pretty darn close to the same preload. Oh, that feels fantastic, actually. Am I going straight to 100? Yes. Oh, perfect. 8 to 12 is what we want. I think we're on the tight side around 8, but yeah, we nailed it at 8. Like, nailed it at 8. That is 8. I don't mind being on the tight side, but that spec right there, 8. Yes. Now let's check the tooth pattern. But Eric, the whole gear is yellow. Yeah, it practically is. It practically is. So I'm gonna try to, luckily this stuff stays relatively wet. Okay, those two seem untouched. This is special gear paint. I got this separate and these acid brushes to go with it. You paint both sides of the tooth. I usually want 3 or 4 at least. Like I said, I've been doing this a little bit. I'm just gonna take it on these teeth, roll them back onto the pinion. I'm gonna put pressure on the gear while I work the pinion so that I get a good contact pattern. I've done another video on the basics of the gear, but there's the drive side and the coast side, and I'm told what you really want to pay attention to on new gears is the drive side. On used gears, the coast side. Let's roll that back in and see what we got. And then go in the other direction too. And what we're checking here is a little bit of the backlash, but also pinion depth is really what we're getting to. That's super critical. We want to make sure that these gears are contacting in perfect alignment. If not, one of two things can happen. They'll be really noisy or they'll explode. Neither one would be good. All right, Eric, kept us in suspense long enough. Look at that. All right, knowing what I know now, looking at this gear tooth pattern, I probably would have stopped here. Yes, it's a little tight on the toe, but I think it would have worn in just fine. However, I spent a significant amount of time putting this video together, and I thought I'd give you a long version so you could see the struggle, and also some of the things I did to try to make corrections to gear tooth patterns. So the rest of the video does have value. However, looking at this, I would have stopped here. Now there's my pattern, which is nice and thin, as opposed to the sharp edges that I had on my old pattern. So the fact that it's softened out like this and it's spread out over a wider area is very encouraging. That being said, I have the Ford PDF manual about this, which I'll post a link to in the description for doing this assembly, and looking at this tooth contact pattern, and it looks like what I have is here, where on the drive side, I'm down in towards the toe, as you can see here, on the drive side. And then on the coast side, I'm out towards the heel, which is here, like this. What it says to correct this, it says backlash is correct, thinner pinion position shim required. So right now I've got a 20 in there, I think I've got a 15. So the reason why I didn't install the pinion seal or install the final crush sleeve or any of that stuff is because I knew there was a possibility of coming back here and doing this. So we have to go through this all over again, start back at the beginning and put that thinner pinion shim underneath there. It's kind of the name of the game. And that's why having a setup bearing like what I had before is a really good idea. But make sure you get a new setup bearing and sacrifice it in order to get these correct. It's a lot quicker to do it that way than having to press this off, or have a really good bearing puller like I do. Here's my dilemma. I'm trying to get this new bearing off, but I was able to get the original one off no problem with this bearing splitter, but there's two problems I'm running into. One of the main ones is this splitter will not get underneath this cage. So I'm gonna have to cut this bearing off, in which case I'm gonna be destroying it. With that being said, I called the Ford dealer and I believe they have one in stock, but I have to get this off of here and get the number. This is why I said, get 2 of these bearings, hollow one out like I showed, and you'll be able to slip it on and off to do all of this setup work. And then when you're ready for final assembly, you'll know what pinion shim to use, and away you go. Got all the important bits sealed off on the axle on the table here, so don't yell at me. Welcome back, viewers. Last we left our differential, we had to cut off the old pinion head bearing off of the pinion because I pressed it on and I needed to put a different size shim in. Wah, wah, wah. Found a solution. Was able to find a place that I could purchase the bearings separately. Now apparently there's 2 companies that make these pinion bearings or bearings for this setup. I'll put links to these in the description, and that's Timken and Koyo. The original bearings that came in the Ford kit were Koyo bearings, and there were some subtle differences between the two. The Koyo bearings were a thicker roller, but there were less of them. These Timken bearings, it seems, they have more rollers, and they are smaller. They both perform the same function. I have gone ahead and purchased 2 of these bearings. I've also gone ahead and hollowed out one of them. You can purchase a setup bearing for about 80 bucks. These were somewhere around 30 bucks a piece. So I just decided to purchase 2 of these, the regular bearings, and hollow out the inside of this in the same way I did originally. In addition, I had to purchase a new race that we're going to need to install now. So we'll knock out the old race for the Koyo bearing and install the Timken race and get started on this process again. Hopefully we get a good gear tooth pattern. We can move on with our lives. Yes, move on with our lives. Setup bearing. Slides on and off nicely. Just gonna knock the race out from the inside here. Learn how to swing a hammer, Eric. Sure thing. The old Koyo race. To further illustrate the point that that setup bearing that I was using was totally wrong, look at where it was making contact inside this race. You can see a definite mark where it was fitting in there incorrectly. Let's knock that new race in, shall we? Goes wicked good with our new bearing. Ooh, yeah. It's not rocket science, but you want to make darn sure it bottoms out when it gets down in there. I'm gonna get all these metal shavings out of here before we get to working some more. Whoa, hey, gonna have to stop you there. Sorry, I know, it's an interruption. This video ended up being a bit more epic than I thought it would be, so I had to split it up into 2 parts. However, I'm going to make a short version of this video that just covers the overview of the differential assembly and setup that I'll put the link to in the description, along with a link to part 2 when it becomes available. It might be somewhere up around my head as well. If you have questions about some of the tools or materials in this video, I'm going to put links in the description to those, so please check there. Also, if you have automotive questions, I'll put a link in the description to EricTheCarGuy.com, which is where I ask you go to get help with your automotive issues. Google+, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if you wish to connect with me socially. Yeah, that's also linked in the description. Be safe, have fun, stay dirty. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.